Welcome to FullBibleTimeline.com. I thought it would be about time that I start doing some teaching videos based upon the timeline. Thank you very much for those of you that have made the purchase over the past 10 years that we've been selling the timeline. And it's taken, prior to that, it took about 7 years just to do the research and develop the timeline. But some things that I find startling came out of the study in the Full Bible Timeline, and particularly around the events of Abraham's life. And as our generation has been moving forward here, there's a couple of key years that are coming up that I think more than ever it's going to be imperative that I break down events in Abraham's life and try and correlate them to this generation. Why I think it's important to understand the significance of 2023 and certainly 2030. So without any ado, we're going to get into what I call the Abraham life code. So first we have to understand the difference in years and how we track years. You are familiar with AD. We're living in that now, 2020 AD. And BC, before Christ. You're probably well aware of that as well, but you may not be aware of AM, Anno Mundi, which is in the year of creation. It's a calculated, it's a terminology, a term referring from the beginning of time. And that, of course, is forever a debatable subject, but in my personal opinion, I believe the Bible does give us a very specific date for when time as we understand it began. So let's take a look at that. The beginning for us, the beginning of time, I would argue, begins with the institution of death, the introduction of death. The beginning of time, I would argue, begins with the introduction of death into the human race. And when did that take place? Well, we know it took place at the fall of man in the garden. When did that take place? The Bible does not give us a specific day. Historians will argue how long was Adam in the garden, but I believe Genesis 5:3 is a very important key verse that tells us that 130 years before Seth was born, that's when death took place, because Adam started keeping track of his age at the introduction of death. There's no way Adam was keeping track of his birthdays when he was eternally minded, living in the garden and going day by day in the presence of God. No more than you will when you're in heaven day by day in the presence of the Lord. You're not going to keep track of time or birthdays because they will cease to have any significance to you at all. So it's important to understand that. It's important to understand Genesis 5:3 says 130 years before, or that Adam was 130 years when Seth was born. That means he started keeping track of his birthdays 130 years before that. I would argue that that's the introduction of death, and that's when Adam and Eve transgressed and were kicked out of the garden. The clock starts here. Why do I say that? It's because the whole Bible is the story of Jesus. It is the story of redemption, which is the purpose of Jesus, and redeeming the mistake that was made in the garden to bring us back into the presence of God and back to the garden. And so understanding that that is the entire plot line of the story helps you to be able to then understand that God gives us a beginning of that event. So from Adam until the flood, just going through the genealogies that are in the Bible, and let me just say something about that. Genealogies that are in the Bible, that's not just filler. Moses wasn't just, thinking what should come next. Let's put a bunch of dates and names that are going to bore everybody to tears, and most people just flip right past them without a second thought. And I'll make all of chapter 5 like that, and why not? We'll do chapter 11 like that too. That's not what he was thinking. That's not what God was thinking, because we do understand that all Scripture is inspired by the Holy Spirit and is there for a purpose. And believe it or not, those chapters are there for a purpose. Matthew chapter 1, what's the purpose? The purpose is to show you Christ's lineage all the way back to Adam. God's trying to set up an unmistakable proof of who Christ is. Now, Genesis chapter 5 and Genesis chapter 11 are doing the same thing, but from the beginning. And they're trying to lay out a foundation. Now, when I was in Bible school, believe it or not, I had professors that would take a look at Genesis chapter 5 and actually make an argument that no, tens of thousands of years were in between Adam and the flood, and the Bible's just giving you the highlighted characters and skipped over multiple generations. And I'm naturally uncomfortable with that, because that dismisses any kind of logical format to Genesis chapter 5, in which there is tons of brilliant math in there. And I'm uncomfortable with just making a speculation and teaching from that point of speculation rather than from a point of fact. So, call me old-fashioned, but I'm going to take the Bible at face value. And when I do, strange things happen. It actually begins to interpret itself and prove itself over and over again. So when you start doing the simple math, which you don't need a PhD to do this, you need a calculator and patience. And you do the simple math from Adam to the flood. You get the year 1656. That's when the flood takes place. And then when you continue doing the careful calculations and you get to the birth of Abraham, a strange thing happens. You get to the year 1948. Now, if you're a student of the Septuagint and that is your preferred gospel, you're not going to get to that year. You're going to get to a totally different year altogether, and you're going to continually get different dates that will have absolutely no meaning in the scheme of eternity, nor will they go to prove the things that, just taking the Bible at face value, will go to prove. So I don't think it's a surprise to God that you and I are sitting here today, that the King James Bible was written, that the math that is in that book, I don't think God was surprised that you'd be holding that book today. I think He's planned it that way. Maybe I'm crazy, but I think He cares enough about this generation to make sure that they got a very clear roadmap to why this generation is so important. Christ did say, when you see this fig tree come back to life, when Ezekiel's valley of dry bones comes back to life, which we know took place May 15th, 1948, Israel became a nation again. It's called the super sign to this generation. And it's there, and it happened for a reason. And what year was that? 1948. So Israel, the seed of Abraham, was born again in the year 1948, and Abraham himself was born in the year 1948. Coincidence? I don't think so. All right, so Terah became the father of Abram, Nahor, and Haran became the father of Lot. Now, while Terah was still alive, we read in Genesis chapter 11 that Haran died, and Terah took his son Abram, his grandson Lot, son of Haran, and his daughter-in-law Sarah, the wife of his son Abram, and together they set out from Ur of the Chaldees to go to Canaan. Why is the father, the patriarch of the family, Terah, taking his family to Canaan? Why are they leaving the Fertile Valley? Why are they leaving any friends or relatives or business community that Terah had spent his lifetime in? Why is he uprooting them and taking them all to Canaan? Why would the patriarch of the family do that? You have to understand ancient cultures, patriarch, he was the head of the household, and nobody did anything without the father's permission. You see that when with Jacob and his 12 sons, 11, that were starving, and Joseph was in Egypt at the time, and the sons wouldn't go back to Egypt without Jacob's blessing. There's a lot of things they wouldn't do without the father's blessing. But it's understood that the patriarch of the family ran the family. So why was Terah gathering up his family to leave? It's a good question. But when they came to Haran, they settled there. So answers to some of these questions can be found in obscure places. And again, you can take this or you can leave it. But here's something to think about. The book of Jasher, I'm not going to say it's gospel. I'm just going to say it's interesting. But it is quoted twice in the Bible. And the book of Enoch is quoted once in the book of Jude. But Jasher is quoted twice. Once in Joshua and once in 2 Samuel. And as far as I know, Samuel was a fairly distinguished prophet who, I think the Bible says, not a single prophecy of his ever fell to the ground void. Okay, so why does Samuel quote from the book of Jasher and Joshua? And it's not just a quote, it's the way they are referencing Jasher. The verses read like this. Is it not written in the book of Jasher? And also it says, behold, it is written in the book of Jasher. Sorry, behold, it is written in the book of Jasher. So both of these statements are at the end of a previous comment, and they're inserted to back up the validity of the previous comment. As a proof, as a, hey, this is a fact because, look it up, it's also in the book of Jasher. I find it interesting that Jasher is mentioned twice. The Bible has this thing about repeating things, and if you missed it the first time, don't miss it the second time. It's there for a reason. Again, if all scripture is inspired, then why are these two verses there that are referencing an external book that you and I don't have currently in our present-day Bible? I'm not going to say, again, that it's gospel. I'm going to say it makes for an interesting read. So what does the book of Jasher say? The book of Jasher, chapter 9, says, And Abram went to Noah and his son Shem, and he remained with them to learn the instruction of the Lord and his ways. And no man knew where Abram was, and Abram served Noah and Shem, his son, for a long time. None of that means anything to you unless you understand what the Jews teach about the early childhood of Abram, about the star that was seen at the day of his birth, about what the prophets or wise guys were saying to the king, who happened to have a name Nimrod at the time, and these wise guys were saying to the king at the time that there's a child born in the house of Terah. His children will rule the world. And so we have to kill him. Without any kind of backstory, because the Bible really picks up the story of Abraham when he's 75 years old in Genesis chapter 12. And it's just before that in Genesis chapter 11 where we read that Terah is taking his family and heading to Canaan. We'd never even heard of Canaan before. Why is Terah going to Canaan? I'd asked that question already. Here's the backstory. The backstory is that Terah substitutes his child with the child of a servant, brings it to the king and said, here's my boy that you were looking for. I'm not even going to withhold my own son from you. Kill him, do whatever you want. And meanwhile, Terah goes home, baskets up Abram, and sends him with a servant to go live with a distant relative who happened to be, Noah and Shem. And this is where Abram's raised, and he spends much of his life, certainly the first quarter of his life, under the tutelage of Shem and Noah, and learns that there is really only one God. This is all going to be new to many of you. This is not new to Jewish rabbis who have taught this for thousands of years. It appears in both the Babylonian Talmud and the Jerusalem Talmud. This is the early history of the father of the Jewish people. And if anybody on the planet has made a study of their own lineage, it would be the Jewish people. So it's mentioned twice in the book of Jasher, or the book of Jasher is mentioned twice in the Bible, and the story also appears in the book of Jasher. I can't find a reason to dismiss it as complete fiction. So I'm going to just put it to the side and say, is there anything else in here that backs up the validity of the character described here, Abram, and the kind of man that he was and the things that he did? So Abram, we know, was born in 1948. He lives for 52 years in the household of Shem and Noah. And it's tradition, I'm going to read from the Babylonian Talmud, that Abraham was 52 years old when he began to convert men to the worship of the true God. From Adam until then, exactly 2,000 years elapsed. That's just a coincidence, I'm sure, right? No, maybe not. Okay, so what we have is Abraham born in 1948. For the first 50 years of his life, he's being taught by Abraham and Shem. He journeys back down to Ur the Chaldees with this revelation that there is only one God. And he finds his father Terah, who you may not fully comprehend, but Terah's one of his hobbies, one of his jobs, was he fashioned idols for a living, and he sold them to the within the community. And that's what he did. He had a garage full of stone and wooden idols that he shaped and fashioned and sold them. And so he was certainly not a monotheistic believer. He believed in anything that could make him a buck, and understood that these weren't deities, but they were, in fact, stone and wood. And the Jews tell a very funny story that is recorded and has been recorded for thousands of years, actually. Here's the funny story. I think you'll enjoy this. Abraham comes back and he sits and meditates in his dad's workshop for quite some time, staring at these wood and stone idols. And he decides, you know what, I'm going to bring a big plate, a meat offering in before these gods, which he does, and sits there for quite a long period of time. Then Abraham gets up, walks out, and comes back with, let's call it a baseball bat. And he takes that baseball bat to all of those gods and lays it down in the arms of the biggest god in the middle of the room. The racket brings his father in, who looks at the devastation and screams at his son, "What have you done?" And Abraham looks shocked. He says, "I didn't do anything. I brought in this plate of this meat offering, and this big god here, he took the baseball bat and he destroyed all these other gods so he could have it all for himself." Well, his father said, "That's ridiculous. They're just stone and wood." And Abraham says, "So why do you worship them? Why do you pray to them?" And walks out. That's not a new story. It's a very, very old story about the character of Abram and how he tried to win his father to this new faith that there is really only one God. Now, while they're in Ur the Chaldees, Abram is winning many people to this faith. Have you ever wondered where all the people came from that were in the entourage with Abram when he finally does leave his father's house? I mean, he rallies up a couple of hundred people to fight against the 5 kings and free Lot. And his couple of hundred soldiers or servants that were very well trained, they had families. They traveled together. So this wasn't just 5 people and a donkey that were moving across the countryside. It was quite the entourage. But anyways, let's come back to the study. So 1948 to 2000, now Abraham has been preaching in Ur of the Chaldees. The king's finding out that, hey, wait a minute, Terah's got a son that's come back into the community, and this guy's a threat. This is the child that was supposed to have been killed, and now so the king is looking for not just Abram, the king is looking for Terah. There's a price on his head. So when Terah in Genesis 11 says, hey, look, let's get out of Ur and we're going to head to this place called Canaan that my son Abraham's talking about, because Abraham had been talking about this God that had visited him and given him promises and given him revelation. So they're fleeing out of Ur the Chaldees. They make it upriver as far as Haran. And then now we really pick up in Genesis 12. And Abraham was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. Abraham took Sarah his wife and Lot his brother's son and all their possessions and that they had gathered, and the people whom they had acquired in Haran. What does it mean acquired? It's not Abraham buying servants, although he may have. But it's really the people that have been converted to this. There is only one God, this God of Abraham, and that are going with him. And they departed to go to the land of Canaan, because Terah had stopped in Haran. And interesting, the name similarity between the son of Terah that had passed away, Haran, and this community Haran that was upriver. And it's just speculation on the similarities to those names. You could imagine what you will. It may be that Terah's son had founded the city or was involved in founding the city, but for whatever reason, Terah can't bring himself to leave this community and stays. And we have Abraham in the year 2023 leaving his father's house. He's leaving the place that was his inheritance. He's leaving his natural family. He's leaving everything behind. And there are those that will speculate, certainly if you're studying in the Septuagint, that Terah had passed away and Abraham waited until his father had died before he went on this journey. But in truth, if you go to the full Bible timeline and you read my study on Stephen's speech, you will see exactly how this is played out. And the Jewish people understood and have taught this for thousands of years now, that Terah was not dead. He was very much alive when Abraham left, and the significance of it. This has been written about exhaustively in both Talmuds. So before you jump to a conclusion, or if you already have a pre-established conclusion that Terah had passed away before Abraham left, then if you have an open mind, please go to my studies and read the research on Stephen's speech, so that you have a full understanding of the significance of what I'm about to show you next. So in the year 2023, we have a man called by God, given a new name by God, promised things by God. He was born in 1948, which correlates to the establishment of the nation of Israel. In the year 2023, at 75 years old, there's a choice that Abraham makes that's very, very significant. Terah was leaving Ur to go to Canaan. He was fleeing. Was he fleeing, or was he called to leave the fertile valley? Going as far as the city of Haran, here Terah stays. So we've established the thinking and the events that led up to the fleeing and the staying. And now we're going to talk about Abraham. Abraham is called to Canaan, and he never sees his father again. Okay? Here's the price that he was willing to pay. Keep in mind, in all the time that Abraham is in Canaan, he forbid his servant Eliezer to take Isaac back there. He was never going to go back. Isaac was never to go back to see his relatives there. Eliezer was to pick out a wife, and was to bring her back. Isaac was completely forbidden to return, and Eliezer had to swear a promise never to take Isaac back there. Abraham didn't want him to go back. Abraham never went back. Abraham understood the consequences of going back, and he understood the significance of the call to follow God's voice. So there was a price to pay for Abraham. Abraham rejects his natural inheritance. He's the eldest. He would have come into the inheritance of everything that Terah had accumulated in his life. But Abraham chose not to have anything to do with any of that, not to benefit from any of that. Rather, he chose God to be his provider. And so again, another significant sacrifice on Abraham's part, and God saying, you don't need anything from your natural inheritance. I'm going to give you an inheritance that is going to outshine that 1,000 times over. Abraham turns his back on cultural norms, caring for his father in his old age, and rejects what he was raised to understand was the meaning of a good son. Now, the Jewish rabbis understood this because there's a commandment that says, honor thy father and mother so that your days may be long. And honoring your father as the eldest would be to care for your father in his old age. And the Jewish rabbis wrestled for thousands of years. This has been discussed and written about. But they wrestled with this concept of what Abraham did, leaving his father and following the call. And understood that, and again, read the research that I've written on Stephen's speech, because according to a Jew, they reckon him dead when he rejects God. And even today, there was an article I teach, I reference this in my seminar, but of a Jewish family whose daughter was marrying a Gentile. This took place in New York. And so normally when your daughter gets married, it's a festive occasion. But this set of Jewish parents actually took out an obituary for their daughter and asked that no flowers or gifts be sent. But to them, because of the choice that she made to marry a Gentile outside the faith, she was dead. Not literally, but figuratively, she's dead to them. Exactly the same thing here. When Abraham had tried to convince his father to come, he did convince Lot and Lot's family. They became believers of a sort. Anyhow, but Terah would not. He would not leave the idols that he would fashion. And so to Abraham, Terah was dead. Years 2023, Abraham is leaving his father's house, leaving his inheritance, and Terah is reckoned unto Abraham as dead. Abraham leaves his land to go to a place God prepared for him. Does this sound a little familiar? Jesus said, I go to prepare a place for you so that where I am, you may be also. The same thing happened here. God's told Abraham, I've already got this place for you to go to. It's called Canaan. I need you to leave this land, leave your family, leave your inheritance, leave your name, leave everything behind, and come to this place I prepared for you. Abraham leaves what future he would have and steps into a destiny prepared by God for him in advance. So, does this sound familiar? Events that are taking place in the year 2023 in Abraham's life. He's 75 years old. And God is calling him to a land, a place that God has prepared for him. In 2023, Abraham has begun to leave Haran and head to Canaan. Now, this is not two guys, walking along. It's not Abraham, Sarah, and a donkey making a beeline for Canaan. You have to put yourself in that cultural condition. It's not a nice, easy Roman road that they're walking on. This is complete cross country with hundreds of people and hundreds of animals to trek across open plain, open territory. So it is not a trip that just takes a week. They had a long way to go, and it's going to take some time, because by the time they get there, this is many, many, many months. One could argue a year to get into the heart of Canaan, and they find a famine, and then the story. They end up in Egypt for a while. Some things happen in Egypt. They accumulate some more wealth, and then they come back to Canaan again. This whole process took approximately 7 years. And I've done some research on that as well to map out the distance and the period of time that it takes. And in fact, there's a wonderful Catholic priest who's passed away since, Father Malachi Martin, wrote a wonderful article about this subject as well, the duration of time that it took for Abraham to travel into Canaan, back into Egypt, the amount of time in Egypt, and then back into Canaan. What we arrive with is the year 2030, a 7-year sojourn to bring Abraham back around into Canaan. And now God shows up, and he's ratifying the blood covenant with Abraham, which, if you understand blood covenant, there's many, many different phases within covenant practice. We do this all the time when we get married, at weddings, and we've just kind of, the symbolism to a lot of these events are still found within the traditional wedding ceremony. And God's doing this with Abraham over a period of years. And here we have Genesis chapter 15. And it came to pass, when the sun went down and it was dark, and behold, there appeared a smoking oven and a burning torch that passed between the two pieces. On that same day, the Lord made a covenant with Abraham. He's 82 years old now. And God had told Abraham, take a couple animals, split them right down the middle. One on the left side, half on the left, half on the right. This is not a new thing to Abraham. cultures in ancient times had been practicing blood covenant for 1,000 years, and he totally understood what this ceremony meant, the significance of it. And it's been practiced in every tribe on the planet, has incorporated within that tribe a form of blood covenant, where a weak tribe covenants with a strong tribe, farmers with warriors, because the warriors realize these farmers know how to make a loaf of bread, and the farmers know that these warriors can keep them safe. So there's a mutual benefit to those people coming together. And God's about to show Abraham that he's going to provide all the benefits. And so this is what the outline looks like right now. 1948, Abraham's born. The year 2000, he's preaching that there is only one God. In the year 2023, he's taken to a land that God has prepared for him. And in the year 2030, he's a witness to animals that are split in half, and God standing in the blood, swearing promises. We call this the Old Covenant. Now, it's just a coincidence, I'm sure, another major coincidence, that exactly 2,000 years from 2030, you get the year 30 AD, which, if you've taken a very careful look at the full Bible timeline, you can see where I've outlined the life of Christ. And his death, inescapable, took place in the year 30 AD. The traditional birth year of Jesus, traditional meaning we're in what's called the Gregorian calendar, and I believe it was 562 or something like that. Pope Gregory decided to move away from the Roman calendar and develop a calendar focused and centered around the life of Christ. It makes me wonder how long it'll take in this world that we're living in now for them to want to introduce a new calendar that has nothing to do with the life of Christ, so we don't recognize that it's been 2020 years, they say, from the birth of Christ. But that aside, you can tell when I made this originally, it was the year 2016, but I've been teaching this for quite some time, and I thought it'd be about time I do a video. So if you bear with me, 2016, just imagine it says 2020 now. So the traditional birth year of Christ is 1 AD, and you end up with 2016 years, or 2020 today. The actual birth year of Christ was 3 BC. The crucifixion of Christ was in 30 AD. He was 33 years old when he died. So from the crucifixion of Christ to today, because Christ lived his whole life in the Old Testament, the New Testament didn't begin until the book of Acts after he died. So we were looking at the covenant that God made with Abraham in the year 2030 AM, and we move forward exactly 2,000 years, and we get to Christ hanging on the cross, and here it is, God in the blood trail again, swearing a second covenant. This we call the New Covenant, and that took place in the year 30 AD. From 30 AD to present, to today, 2020, you have 1,990 years. So from 30 AD to today, 1,990 years. 1990 is the year that it has been, that's the year it is, from the crucifixion. So the New Testament period has only been around for 1990 years. Interesting. So let's take a look at the Jerusalem Talmud. Let's try and give you a couple of external proofs for the year 30 AD besides everything else that I've done. Take a look at this. In both Talmuds, the Jerusalem Talmud and the Babylonian Talmud, Jewish history, which I think is safe to say they weren't fans of Jesus, but they do record some interesting events in the Talmud. 40 years before the destruction of the temple, and we know that took place in 70 AD, the western light went out, the crimson thread remained crimson, and the lot for the Lord always came up in the left hand. They would close the gates of the temple by night and get up in the morning to find them wide open. Similar passage in the Babylonian Talmud. During the last 40 years before the destruction of the temple, the lot did not come up in the right hand, nor did the crimson-colored strap become white, nor did the western most light shine, and the doors of the temple would open by themselves. Strange things were happening during ceremonies on the Temple Mount, and they couldn't keep the doors closed. It took about 7 men on each side to close those doors every night, but in the morning they'd find the temple wide open. The temple ceased to function, and they noted this from 70 AD, and they note that for 40 years. Well, that would take us back to 30 AD. What significant event took place in 30 AD? Christ was crucified, ending temple sacrifices. And it's external proof that I feel is quite conclusive to the 30 AD date. So we have 30 AD, Christ is crucified, to present day 2020. It's a difference of 1990 years. So it'll be 2,000 years. It will be. This is inescapable. It's just math. From 30 AD, when Christ was crucified, to the year 2030, that will be exactly 2,000 years of New Testament era. I can't make that up. That's just simple math. 2030 is going to be 2,000 years from the death of Christ on the cross. You just happen to be living in a generation that's about to witness that. And some things that take place before. Now, understanding, God's not surprised that we are using the Gregorian calendar, because God's watched this entire play out. He knows the end from the beginning, and he knew that you and I would be sitting here and looking at our calendar on the wall, and we would call it the year 2020. We would be going by this Gregorian calendar. And God's like, I know my kids are going to be looking at that during that last generation. Therefore, when it comes to the date that Israel becomes a nation, I'm going to want that to be in the year 1948, so that it coincides with the birth of Abraham. My kids are going to really dig that. So in November 1947, when the UN was approached with this idea to create a nation and call it Israel, and limit the acceptance of Jews to that very, very small territory, and limit the number of Jews that would be accepted into that territory to a total of 500,000. That was November 1947. It was rejected by all Arab nations, and the whole thing got postponed for 6 months. Well, in May 1948, that would be the right year, the UN moved it through and made it a nation in a day. The second go-round got much, much bigger land territory given to the Jews, and restrictions on immigration reduced. So, I shouldn't say reduced, almost eliminated, so that the Jews could make a home for themselves. But again, instead of 1947, it took place in 1948. You could say that's a coincidence. I would say I can see the hand of God in that. The crucifixion. So here's what I want you to see. We've got the natural that takes place. In the natural, we're watching Israel become a nation. And then the spiritual is coming over top of that. What's the spiritual? The spiritual is those that are born again. So the Jews are getting their nation back. The children of Abraham are getting their nation back. But the children of Abraham that have been grafted in, those that believe by faith, we're watching something else take place as well. We're watching Israel become a nation, which to us is a super sign, and we're watching the death of Christ on the cross in 30 AD and the fulfillment of another 2 days, 2,000 years, that takes you to 2030. So to recap, from Adam to Abraham at 52, preaching that, hey, I got a revelation, there's only one God. And he starts preaching this message. We have 2,000 years or 2 days. Then that covenant is established with Abraham in 2030, and we have 2 days to the crucifixion, 2,000 years. From the crucifixion to the year 2030, which is only 10 years away, we have 2,000 years. This math is inescapable. Now we have this little period that the church traditionally, what we call the tribulation years. If we are in Christ, then we are partakers of the blessing of Israel and all the nations in the redemptive work of Christ. Believers become the spiritual descendants of Abraham, Galatians chapter 3. So, a period of 7 years takes place before the second coming, before the year 2030, when instead of a baby, Jesus is coming back as a king. And yeah, there's going to be an alien invasion where the sky cracks open and he steps back into the scene from his dimension into our dimension. I call it an alien invasion because Paul does refer to us as we are aliens not of this world. And if ever you are going to witness an alien invasion, it will be that of Christ splitting the eastern sky, stepping into this dimension, and laying down some new laws and a new way of caring for and maintaining this beautiful planet that we live on. So, but prior to that, there's going to be 7 years of chaos, 7 years called the tribulation, and you could be pre-trib, post-trib, mid-trib. That part really doesn't matter to me. But I do want to correlate the 2023 to what took place in Abraham's life, being called out from his father's home, being given a new name, covenant rights being established, given a new a place prepared for him, and correlate that to a lot of things that Jesus was saying about us as the church, and he's going to prepare a place for us. We're given a new name. So the correlation to all of those covenant practices and covenant events take place to us as the church. And I believe there's a strong argument for 2023 and being a significant year for that. So, total recap here. Israel's born as a nation in 1948. Abraham was born in 1948. Abraham leaves his home in the year 2023. Perhaps we will be leaving our home in the year 2023. The covenant is established with Abraham in blood and God swearing promises in the year 2030. Christ is crucified in the year 30 AD, exactly 2,000 years. And 2,000 years from Christ's crucifixion will be the year 2030. You just can't get away from that. So, perhaps 2030 introduces what's called the kingdom years, or the millennial reign of Christ. So I welcome you to visit the Full Bible Timeline for a more in-depth study on this and many, many other subjects. And I certainly welcome your thoughts and emails. So feel free to drop me a line. There's a couple of things. There's a verse in the Old Testament and a verse in the New Testament that says a day is 1,000 years and 1,000 years is but a day. And that's God referring to his perspective, his viewpoint on that. And it's interesting if you do a word study on the last days and a word study on the day of the Lord. The day of the Lord is always speaking of judgment. It's always speaking to a time of judgment. And the last days, when that phrase is used, and Joel prophesied, in the last days God will pour out his Spirit. In the last days the sons and daughters will prophesy. The last days, plural. It's talking about 2 days. One could argue that that's the last 2,000 years. Day 1, day 2. From Christ's crucifixion in 30 AD to 2030, those would be the last 2 days. The day of the Lord, one could argue that that is the millennial reign, the last day, the 7,000 or the 7,000th year, the millennial reign, the 1,000 years reign of Christ on earth. It just makes for some interesting dialogue. Now, I'm just trying to give you food for thought, and if you've watched this, for going on 45 minutes now, then congratulations. If you like it, give me a thumbs up or share this video. And again, I welcome your thoughts and comments as well. I think 2023 is going to be significant. I watch the news and what's going on in America and the world today, and it's almost impossible not to see a spirit of madness, a spirit of Antichrist, and a spirit of complete insanity that seems to be sweeping the world. So I think what we are also watching is the end of a currency war that is going to lead to a hot war. And I think the dominoes are set up for war in the Middle East. And this is going to be a real dangerous time if you're a believer in the Middle East. Not so much if you're where I am on the west coast of Canada, where, I don't mean to be light about it, but I do say to my kids, you got the best seats in the house. You're going to be able to sit here and watch events take place, I think, until the year 2023. But between now and then, things have got to get a lot worse, because in 2023 the world's going to be in such a bad shape that they're going to beg for a redeemer, somebody to save them from their plight, economic, social, militarily, in every aspect. The world will be on its knees. So between now and 2023, the next 3 years, economically, socially, things are going to completely fall apart. I know you think they've already fallen apart. No, you haven't. This is just the beginning of sorrows. But I think that's what takes place before the world will bow its knee completely to an antichrist figure. And I know that there's a whole school of believers that dismiss the millennial kingdom altogether. They dismiss the idea of an antichrist. And I would just say, history does repeat itself. Well, Mark Twain said history doesn't repeat itself, but it sure does rhyme. And if you were a believer, a Christian in Germany in 1933, what would you think? Would you think that your nation is following an antichrist figure? I bet you would. If you're a smart enough Christian, you got out of Germany in time and you were able to watch the events from perhaps America and look at what was going on in Europe. It did seem very much like it was the end of the world. And they were, those in Germany were following an antichrist figure. Historically, I think you can't argue that Hitler was definitely an antichrist figure. History put that figure there as an example for this generation right now. Don't think for a second that we will not witness a similar type figure rise out of the ashes of what is going to be left here. You just need to be aware, and you need to be prepared for that. So I'm doing a bunch of things that I feel we need to do to prepare, and you're welcome to email me and ask. But it's going to be very interesting. I'm going to do some more videos and talk about some more things related to the events of today and pull teachings from the full Bible timeline. So I just invite you to come with me on this journey. I apologize. It's taken 10 years for me to put some of these videos together. But I have spent 10 years traveling the world. So now back in Canada. So you get a treat. If you want, share, like. Thank you very much.